do one on citalopram? What about Prozac and Zoloft and Lexapro? So y'all have been asking me about antidepressants a lot, and so I figured I might as well do a down and dirty video on SSRIs from a drug scientist perspective. Like, why do you get brain zaps when you stop taking them? What are the different side effects for the different types of SSRIs? And are they actually addictive? So SSRIs are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and I'll explain what that means in a little bit, but what you need to know is that they are one of the most widely used types of antidepressants out there because they're pretty safe and they are at least moderately effective. So they're used to treat depression, but they're used to treat like a wide variety of other things. So for example, I take Lexapro for my generalized anxiety disorder. You can take it for things like OCD and PTSD and panic disorder and bulimia. It's also used for bipolar and social anxiety and PMDD, and those are just the FDA accepted uses. It can be used off label for all sorts of other things. Now, like the name says, SSRIs work on serotonin. So they're working by increasing serotonin. So selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, it is preventing that serotonin from being recycled back from that neuron and thus makes serotonin produce more of an effect. And it's linked to this idea of the monoamine hypothesis. So this idea that just like low serotonin is linked to depression. Now, it's not as necessarily simple as that. It's not just like low serotonin means you have depression, but it is one thing that we can actually treat. Now, one of the major problems that we have with SSRIs is that they take a long time to actually work. So on average, it takes about 2 to 6 weeks to see if one of them is going to actually treat depression. Now, taking 2 to 6 weeks to produce effects is actually very difficult for somebody with a psychological disorder to deal with. Like, you are still stuck in that state that brought you to seek help in the first place. And then what if that first antidepressant doesn't work and now you have to try another? Now that's just been months without actually seeing any sort of progress. And we think we know why it takes so long because it's actually changing basically your brain in order to produce its effects. So it's basically causing an increase of serotonin after a few weeks of just kind of like working in your system. And it seems to also be actually creating new neurons in certain areas, but that again takes a while to see. So there's a study showing that escitalopram or Lexapro is basically just like, yeah, it's creating new neurons, but it's taking at least 35 days to produce those effects. So that change in your brain that is helping with the depression, that takes a while to get there. And that doesn't even take into account that initially you might see an increase of negative effects of the drug. So like the first week, there's this initial dip in serotonin levels. So a lot of people say that they have like increased anxiety when they first start taking them for that first week. But then that goes away because again, it takes a long time for your brain to change. Now, each drug is a little different in terms of how it works in your brain. So for example, Lexapro is like the most selective for serotonin, whereas things like Zoloft also have some effects in the dopamine system, which explains why some people react differently to Zoloft than some of the other SSRIs. But they're primarily working on that serotonin system. And this is both good and bad. So it's good in that if you aren't working on other systems like dopamine, you might not have problems with like the reward system, but it also might not help treat things like reward problems. So like with other medications that increase dopamine, so things like ADHD medications that work as stimulants, and medications for things like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, if they increase dopamine, they can have some problematic cognitive effects later on. And they can also cause some issues with things like addiction. And you're unlikely to see these problems with SSRIs. So it's very unlikely to cause addiction. I read one study on this because I was like, wait, do people actually use SSRIs in a way that constitutes addiction? And there are some people who apparently go ahead and inject SSRIs and also just take very high doses of it, but it's pretty rare because SSRIs are not causing that like high or euphoria that drugs that increase dopamine typically tend to. Now, one of the big negatives of SSRIs is that they might cause serotonin syndrome. So any drugs that increase serotonin can actually cause interactions with other drugs that increase serotonin. And you want to hear the giant list of drugs that can potentially increase serotonin? Here we go. St. John's wort, blow, Molly, lithium, antidepressants and anti-anxiety drugs, not shocking, over-the-counter cold medication, acid, L-Dopa, migraine medications, and things like fen and oxy. We don't actually know how common serotonin syndrome is. There's not really a good way of telling this because symptoms are so varied. So they can range from mild, like high blood pressure, to then hyperthermia for moderate, and then severe, like seizures and even death. but we can't actually study how much serotonin is flowing in our brain at any point in time. Well, in humans, we can in rats, we can't study it in humans. So we just basically say that somebody has serotonin syndrome if we rule out everything else and it seems like they have serotonin syndrome. So do you have the symptoms and have you used multiple things that increase serotonin? Yeah, that's probably a problem. Now, SSRIs by themselves also cause a lot of side effects. So we're talking about things like headaches, irritability, dizziness, problems with being able to sleep. A lot of people get nausea from them. And then you have the sexual side effects, which are more common in certain types than others. So Paxil, one type of SSRI, is very strongly linked to things like weight gain and also some of those sexual side effects, where you get the cardiac side effects in some of the others. Like citalopram is more closely linked to cardiac issues. Then there is a black box warning on SSRIs saying that they might lead to suicidal ideation. Now, this is a discussion for another day. This is actually a controversial subject, so if you want me to talk about this, I will, but it is listed as one of the side effects for the drugs. Enough so that the FDA actually puts a warning on the box about it. Now, one of the major problems with SSRIs is going through withdrawal. So this can happen if you just, forget to get your prescription re-upped and you go on vacation. Or maybe your doctor is late in putting the prescription through, you haven't had an annual in a while, so they just don't re-up it until you do. 55 to 65% of people who have taken antidepressants will actually go through withdrawal. And this is called discontinuation syndrome. And this is weird. Like, my students ask me about this all the time because they're like, hey, so I have started having these brain zaps and it just feels like lightning shooting through my brain. And in my head, I'm like, have you stopped taking your antidepressants? I can't come up with a good way of asking you this because it is not my business, but also is a thing that's probably going to cause brain zaps. Literally like lightning bolts through your brain. It is called a sensory problem when it comes to the discontinuation syndrome. And these discontinuation symptoms typically start between 2 to 4, sometimes even up to 10 days after you stop taking your last dose, or even if you kind of lower your dose. And they can last 1 to 2 weeks or sometimes a year later. You get all sorts of terrible symptoms other than just brain zaps. So you get things like aggression and mania, insomnia, and very vivid dreams and nightmares. You don't feel as much a reward, and you also might hallucinate. And again, over 50% of people experience this. So yes, SSRIs are really helpful to a large group of people, but they also have some serious side effects that people need to consider before they decide whether this is the correct thing for them to be using. It's popular enough to work for millions, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work for you.